near these wells, and I do have some of these smaller wells in my district that have seen that. So I also need to worry about the when, not the if, but when this could be a catastrophe in my district also. But if we are, and this is for the ISO, my last question. We've been talking a lot about reliability. You've mentioned that you're thinking of plans to supplement, so we don't have to have these curtailments and not get to these points that I'm worried about. What does that cost? And are these costs that we're going to be passing to ratepayers? We talk in this committee a lot about cost shifting to our low-income residents that I represent a big chunk of in my district. Are these plans that we're looking at? I mean, what kind of costs are we going to be incurring, and are ratepayers going to be affected when non-core customers that are served by stations that won't be able to produce electricity possibly because they don't have gas, so they're going to have to do alternatives, and we no longer have this local source? Are we going to see an increase in cost?
I think there could be some increase in cost because we always try to optimize the system, go to the lowest cost supply. People are buying gas, trying to minimize their cost of supply. I think the storage facilities were part of that strategy. And so there could be some impacts on costs. Just as I said, we're trying to minimize the impacts on reliability. We're also trying to take measures that would mitigate those impact costs. And again, I want to emphasize, we're not trying to do those things at the expense of health or safety. We absolutely believe there needs to be safety first and foremost, proper inspections of the wells. I'm here just to talk about what the potential impacts of the reliability are and those measures that we're taking to mitigate those.
So some of what's the bill is codifying is something that's in the executive order, and I get the flexibility leaving some of our constituents and people that are living there feeling really uncomfortable, and that's part of the desire to codify this and also go a little bit further. I understand that, but I am on the reverse side where the cost, reliability issues make me a little bit uncomfortable with the lack of flexibility. So for me, it's how do we create that flexibility in here so that when I go home I could explain that to my constituents also, who are also following this closely. I don't want to pretend that they're not following this closely. Following it closely for lots of different reasons, and I go home to statements about two Californias. In California, the reality of how Porter Ranch has been dealt with, and the reality of the California, how Exide has been dealt with, which you spoke about. And it still feels like that double standard continues, even though we had a giant victory for the community last week. And so for me, it's that flexibility, which the executive order gives us. But I understand. So where's that balance? How do we get to that balance? In concept, at least.
You know, as well as I, on the putting things in statute, how important it is, whether it's oversight on DTSC or seismic safety, or when we were accidentally putting oil wastes into protected aquifers, and the list goes on, putting things into statute with oversight. And we took clarifying amendments. We're trying to get all this done by January 1st of next year. Most of the incurred costs from a well that has yet to be determined, there will be lots of lawsuits, and the PUC is fining SoCal Gas as well as South Coast Air District and our Attorney General, who isn't in litigation. But most of the costs will be incurred by SoCal Gas as far as their and this is not out of general fund. And there is a bill, I think, carried by Senator Allen relating to ratepayer versus shareholder and SoCal Gas costs. They have $1 million in insurance, or $1 billion in insurance out there. So this is not supposed to be shifted to the ratepayers.
Well, okay, so I get the SoCal side, but if I am a producer, let's say it's the LADWP, for example, is one of them, they are a non-core customer, and they would not have access to that gas anymore to produce electricity. Wherever, if I have to get it elsewhere, it's not local, it might be more expensive. And then do I shift that expense as an electric provider? I shift that expense to the ratepayers?
Yeah, I can't speak for LADWP, but as my understanding, they have at least some flexibility to, in a similar way, the ISO does, to shift some of their supply outside the gas-fired resources in the basin. But I can't speak to how that impacts their costs and how much flexibility they have to do that.
But that cost will not be covered by the SoCal. It'd still be a rate. It's cost shift to electricity users.
I'm not quite sure how those would be recovered, but usually those are embedded within the cost of operating and serving their electric demand.
So the CPUC was the CPUC where they'll have.
And also, Senator Allen has a bill relating to costs and making sure that the ratepayers are protected.
The electricity ratepayers who are non-core. I mean, it's by default, it's one step away because the non-core customers.
Technically, the non-core customer, by nature of the fact that they're non-core, has responsibility for procuring their supply. So I don't know that answers your question exactly, but
So if it's more expensive, if I'm a non-core and I'm having to get someplace else this additional energy that I would have had through this gas, and it costs more money, would I pass that additional cost to my ratepayers?
ultimately, barring any way to shift it somewhere else, I believe that's the case.
So by April, we would have a better understanding from the ISO of what this plan would be to mitigate some of these reliability issues, and we would be able to have an idea about costs also for non-core.
I guess we're focusing our efforts on the reliability piece of it in terms of, and then the mitigation measures to mitigate the reliability piece. I don't know if I'll have cost impacts at that point, but I understand the ask, and we'll see what can be done.
I doubt there's going to be good information on cost implications in April on this. There's going to be a lot of variables that can happen during the course of the summer that would impact markets, and it would be highly speculative to imagine how the markets might be impacted in April for the future. So I think the immediate task at hand is to deal with the reliability issues and
deal with the safety of the wells, try to put them into
probably
different categories, ensure energy reliability, and do it as in a timely way. And I should point out
before you point that out, right.
We're doing on $5 a day off of food stamps to pay your bills, to get your meals. It really is an important thing, even if it's cents every day. It adds up.
I think the frustration that you're hearing from members of the committee and certainly members of the public is that we're being asked to make a decision. We're trying to make the most informed decision. We had a regulator just last week come out and tell Southern Californians that they would have to ration their use of energy, just like we've been rationing our use of water for the last several years. And everybody's fine with doing our part, but when you start having concerns like this and we can't get an answer, because a lot of Ms. Garcia's concerns and a lot of the concerns of other members of this panel will not come into play unless reliability becomes an issue. And the question that we keep coming back to, which we have not gotten an answer yet to, is if you took, and I'm sure you've got these statistics, if you took the 6 or 7 worst days in the summer where electric usage was off the charts, it was your peak 7 days in June in Southern California. It was 110-degree heat for 7 days, and everybody was running their air conditioner, and everybody kept it running late at night, so the peaker plants were firing at full capacity. What is the natural gas usage for like that week? And then if we know that that natural gas usage exceeds what the system can produce, then these reliability concerns come into play. So that's what our frustration is we need these answers before we vote on this on the floor. And the experts, I mean, look, I'm not a scientist and I'm a slow-moving, dim-witted legislator. But if I could get the statistics that I got at the beginning of this hearing, then I would expect that the experts could do light years better than me. So what am I missing here?
Mark Rothleiter. I appreciate what you described, the complexity of how the gas system operates and how it integrates with the electric system is more complicated than that. We've taken 4 cases, a high peak utilization day, a high ramp day where there was a large amount of change from the day ahead expectation to the real time. We've taken days where there was a large intraday ramp.
Rather than dealing with the different nuances, and I understand that they're nuanced, how about just a statistic of how much gas did the electrical generation use for the 7 highest days on record? That would help. Okay, we're next going to go to Mr. Hadley, followed by Mr. Obernolte, Santiago, and Patterson. Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And first, I'd just like to thank the authors for bringing the bill, and Assemblyman Wilk and your staff, briefing my staff and me, has been helpful. And then finally, Mr. Chairman, I just want to applaud you for going out of regular order and bringing this. I think that the issues that have been fleshed out in this committee today are a great example of why we needed to have this hearing now and not this summer. So thank you for doing that. I have a very specific question, then I have a more general question. The specific question, the bill, if I understand it, includes a moratorium on withdrawals, except in the case of reliability concerns, and the governor's executive order does not. Is the proposed moratorium on withdrawals, is that due to the health and safety issues related to withdrawals, or is it an attempt to preserve the reserve of gas for reliability purposes?
We had agreed with the PUC on the 15 billion cubic feet that needs to be left into that. The real concern is how much more gas you would try to put in the reservoir before you tested the wells because of the stress on the structural well casings.
So you want to keep the 15 billion to preserve a safe pressure in...
Well, the 5 is, they can probably explain it better.
They can
5
take
is
it down
the
to
minimal,
5.
15 with some wells gradually back online. You don't have to fill it all the way to 86 billion cubic feet to have energy reliability. The idea is to ramp it up as we go through the summer.
Okay. So to get to my more general and to me my more important question, you stated yourself earlier that this is a balancing issue. That obviously, our first and foremost concern is the safety of the community, the safety of the residents. But we do have all the reliability issues that have been flagged in this committee. And the process that the bill lays out requires the concurrence of 3 state agencies to opine as to the need for withdrawals to meet reliability needs. If I understand, it's Dogger, it's the PUC, and the Energy Commission. That's a little troubling to me in 2 ways. The first is these are balancing issues, and each of these agencies has somewhat different missions, but balancing priorities is not their job in certain respects. That we have the governor who's acting under the authority of his executive order now, but having 3 unelected agencies to agree on anything is not a quick process. And this is a balancing act, as you indicated. And then secondly, related to that, one of the organizations that is not asked to opine on this is ISO. And, my office and I have certainly valued their expertise in terms of understanding the sustainability of the grid and the balancing act required to make the grid work. So, today we have the governor using his executive authority, which has the virtue of flexibility in terms of managing these competing claims. The bill proposes the concurrence of 3 agencies, but not the involvement of ISO. So I know that's a big question, but how do you think we best balance the competing interests organizationally, procedurally, to get to the right answer when we are dealing with the very real issues of reliability on the system?
Well, the CEC and the CPUC are probably the 2 agencies that have the most jurisdiction over reliability, setting aside CalISO for a minute. And they would just review Dogger's analysis of the testing on the well casing to make sure that we're all on the same page. CPUC, grants the permits for these reservoirs or their wells. Dogger's the one that's there to physically put them in. And so I think that collaboration is real important. We've gotten in trouble in other circumstances when different agencies are not collaborating together, balancing. They're looking at the integrity of the wells and the safety of the wells first, and then addressing the issue of energy reliability. Governor Brown has really tasked the CEC, Chairman Weisenmuller, as well as having input from CalISO on the whole reliability action plan as far as addressing how we would reduce demand through demand response and other kinds of flex rules. This is complicated. We want to get this right. But in the meantime, residents are moving back in, and we've got to make sure that all those wells aren't opened up without adequate safeguards in place and responsible agencies helping take ownership of that decision.
I 100% agree with the goal. Absolutely. I am concerned that having 3 different agencies required to concur on anything in a situation where we're trying to meet multiple objectives is a delicate dance to make work well.
Well, we'll be continuing. We have a set of amendments that we're working with the administration on. I'm not sure if that kind of concern is in that. I will carefully look at it. I do note that the governor's amendments don't call out energy reliability as their primary issue. They're talking about safety first.
Right.
And that's their goal. So allow me the opportunity to see what those amendments are through the administration. And then we have to also look at the draft regulations by Dogger in how we're testing the wells and putting them into categories.
And if I may, maybe to give you some comfort, and it sounds like, Senator Pavley, that you're okay with this, we also want to clarify that the agencies can concur rapidly, that they can do it by a letter by the executive director and not a proceeding, because a CPUC proceeding can take 7 years. All right, thank you.
Yes, we know that, don't we, Mr.
Yes, we definitely.
No, it's not a proceeding. It's not a hearing. It's a review of the analysis that was up to the standards.
Thank you.
Thank you. Also.
Thank you. All right, next we have Mr. Obernolte.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I want to thank Senator Pavley for being so open and forthright in your discussions with the committee. I have some concerns with the specificity of the bill, and I think it revolves around some of the things that Dr. Quirk was talking about earlier, particularly the use of subjective terms in the bill language.
The state of the art, I made note of. Anything else?
Well, I'll raise one. I mean,
Okay.
When we say regional energy reliability, I would say that that's something that's very much open to interpretation. And just to follow up on something that Assemblywoman Burke was asking, I have a question about the CEC. So, say for the sake of argument that we're facing a situation this summer where you're considering lifting the moratorium on extracting natural gas from this oil field. And say that you're looking at a situation where you're going to curtail some electricity generation as a result of the lack of natural gas from the pipeline. But the ISO is telling you that there's sufficient electricity available elsewhere in the state to meet the demand. Does that constitute a regional energy reliability problem, or does it not?
I'm going to ask CalISO how that would work out. We were talking about you could shift demands. Or
Yeah, well, that's my point. Is that
there's no pipeline directly connected to Southern California, if that's one of your things. So.
Well, no, I'm talking about electricity. So I'm saying that we're going to have to curtail because we're out of natural gas, but we can shift it.
Let me ask CalISO if they have a response.
Well, what I consider electric reliability at that point is that we're at the risk of having to interrupt electric demand. Moving supply around is something that we do on a regular basis, and so we have some leeway to do that. There may be cost implications, but moving generation around, moving supply around, in my mind, in and of itself does not constitute a reliability issue until you get to the point where it's a large enough quantity or complex enough that it becomes a jeopardizing reliability. And that's why I did say and earlier that we need clear procedures. What is the point at which reliability kicks in that we could withdraw from the Aliso Canyon to maintain that reliability? And these types of operational decisions are happening on the operational floor in real time. We need clear direction, clear procedures, because those types of decisions cannot be delayed.
Okay, I completely agree with you, and I just would like it to be clear, because my concern is that when we handcuff you with legislation that is vague, we leave you in the unenviable position of having to make those determinations on a case-by-case basis, and I really would, I don't want to put you in that position. And one further question that I'm a little unclear on. I think we're all incentivized to make sure that the wells that are continue to be in production are thoroughly tested, but I'm wondering if I would rather see a plugged well than a tested well. I think a plugged well has a much lower risk of failure than just a tested well. And it's not clear to me that SoCalGas has the option in this legislation of electing to proactively plug a well, not abandon it, but plug it, rather than test it, test the other wells that they want to leave unplugged, and then leave the possibility open that later they might complete the testing and then remove the plug. Is that something that they would be empowered to do?
The way that Dogger's sort of sending out their testing strategy would be going through the testing of everything, but for those who, after 20 days more testing and then they're finally okay, they could perhaps go ahead. Then the temporary plug on the other wells that can be potentially maybe used later depending upon additional considerations or structural integrity questions that have to be resolved, but it could get plugged and then still be perhaps fixed to be operational at some point in time. If not, it'll be permanently killed.
Okay.
But there's an interim use as far as
That's good to hear.
some go ahead, some plug. But
I
could
think
be
that from a risk evaluation standpoint, I think it's riskier to have a well that's been tested than a well that's just been plugged. And so I'd like to see them have the ability to do that. And I don't think the legislation as it's currently written allows that.
Okay.
So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. So we have two last members who wish to speak. That is Mr. Santiago is not back, so it's Vice Chair Patterson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
Really appreciate everybody's seriousness and thoroughness in all of this. Just two quick questions to the ISO. You laid out a menu of essentially reliability management processes. Have you ever done those kinds of processes before with the similar kinds of reliability challenges that are before you?
Yeah, some of these we've deployed before. A few years ago, we had to do a similar action plan for the closure of San Onofre. This may be a little bit different in the sense of how we operate and in coordination with the gas system, but some of these things like flex alerts and activating demand response has been deployed before. Now, do we need some additional public recognition and demand response capability? Perhaps that's something that can be done in the short order. Some of the things like coordination with the Southern Cal Gas system operator and LADWP, we do that coordination today. We're talking about enhancing that coordination for the situation at hand, and so that's something we do today. Some of these have to do with gas balancing rules. Those are something I think that are in the purview of the CPUC, and maybe they could speak to those rules in terms of the operational flow orders and those types of issues. In terms of dispatching and redispatching resources out of the area, this is something that we are constantly doing in terms of redispatching the system, and we can add additional constraints to reinforce that type of dispatch.
So that the management of the reliability that you just outlined, those are similar in scope and difficulty?
They're similar in scope. The frequency at which we have to deploy these things may be a different matter in this situation, and that becomes then, do we have the right procedures in place, the right training in place for that?
Anything new and untried in your menu?
I'll throw in one for the future. We talked about Western Grid coordination integration, correct?
Let's not open that.
For this one.
All right.
So I think to some degree, except for the readjustment of the gas balancing rules, I think to some degree there's some level of these that have already been used in the past. It's a matter of enhancing them and getting used to the frequency of them.
And using those menus in times past, did that result in service interruptions or brownouts, or were you able to manage through without the consequences that members here have expressed?
For how these were used in past situations, I would say that we were able to utilize these and avoid interruptions.
Then would you then what help us understand the level of surety that you can give us that, given what we know and the time frame in which we are looking and the demand issues, that you what is it, an 80% probability, a 50-50, depends on the weather, what?
It depends on the weather, and it depends on the conditions and how well you set up going into the day. The better you set up in terms of the gas procurement, the less risk you are of having these issues materialize in real time.
Good. Thank you. Appreciate that. I had to step out a little bit ago. The reliability proposed amendments that the food processors outlined and CMTA outlined, are you taking those amendments, or are you in the process of incorporating them into the bill?
Thank you for that question. They didn't spell those out specifically, although the gentleman from the manufacturing brought up the concept of all wells inspection, concerned about all wells being inspected before any injection. And we were talking about, yes, all wells will be inspected, but then some wells perhaps can get through the testing quicker than others, and they could be put back into operation sooner than later. That's the concept.
Okay.
We're going to go over Dogger's regulations on their testing strategy of 6-7 part stages, and maybe we can help resolve that problem.
Okay.
Because that would address both.
Good.
I'm here because of the safety concerns that the residents that are legitimate. I'm sure they're sort of frustrated behind me because we're talking about trying to balance that with energy reliability, which has really not been defined and actually is not in the governor's state of emergency. But so working with the administration and working with Dogger, I think we can come up with a thoughtful approach by the time it gets to the floor. And by then we may have a little bit more information from Cal ISO.
Is the member of the CMTA still here?
And Mr. Shaw, you can use that microphone there.
And again, not being here for the entire hearing and all of that, has the arc of the discussion and the movement that has been outlined here sufficiently encouraged you that the oppose can be moved to either a neutral or a support?
I think that the discussion has moved in that direction. I think the senator understands the concerns that we have regarding energy reliability, and I do think that the amendments are starting to work in that direction. Obviously, the extent to which the tests and the number and the extent of those tests would influence the time with which that is required would be something that I think deserves some additional attention. Obviously, CAISO, PUC, and CEC are continuing to work on their analysis, and as Assemblymember Quirk and Oberelty also mentioned, that concern about that, the questions regarding that issue certainly deserve additional attention, and to the degree to which that analysis could be accelerated to address those questions would certainly help clarify those issues. But I do think the discussion has gone in a positive direction. Again, as I mentioned earlier, the conversations with the senator's staff regarding this issue have been positive, I think helpful.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. All right. That concludes all of the questions or comments. Any further questions or comments from the panel? All right, Mr. Santiago.
I will not repeat any of the questions that my colleagues had mentioned.
Thank God.
But I would echo some of those. And if it hasn't been already said, would the author just consider working with the City of LA, as you've already mentioned, and DWP, if it hasn't already been mentioned, to ensure that we don't have any blackouts or cost
Mayor
issues.
had a representative here, and so I'm sure she'll be taking that to the
Thank you.
back to the mayor.
Final question, folks. We promise this is Mr. Hernandez.
Well, it's not really a question. I just want to move it. But before I move it, I want to say thank you to Senator Pavley for bringing this issue forward. This matter is really about public safety and public health. So thank you for working closely with this committee and focusing on the reliability concerns as this move progresses. I want to move it. I think it's timely. The community is upset, and it's not a partisan issue amongst the community. But I am heartened to see that here in the legislature, there is a bipartisan effort to address the problem. The bill isn't perfect yet, but I believe that there is a genuine commitment to make it as good as we can get it. So with that, I move the bill.
Terrific. The motion is due pass as amended with urgency to appropriations. It's been properly moved and seconded. Just before you close, I will just state that we really appreciate your work on behalf of this community. They have felt so affected by this, rightfully so, and it's clear that we need to make them feel safe before they go back to their homes. And we also want to make sure that we do that, we balance reliability so that we don't add insult to injury, so that when folks return to those homes in the San Fernando Valley in mid-August, that their air conditioners work. So we really thank you for your work, and you may now close.
Yes, I just want to again thank your staff on the clarifying amendments. I think that served us well. Thank you for the discussion. This is an urgency item, but I do realize we need to address your concerns before it gets to the floor. I'd like to thank you for your cooperation, allowing us to move this forward. And at the end of the day, residents are moving in. We want to make it safe. They're very concerned on whether they can move back at all, and want to make sure that we have their back to make sure the agencies do what they said they're going to do. And they will be providing the necessary oversight over Southern California Edison. I also would like to thank my joint authors and co-authors on either side of me, as well as Senator De Leon and Senator Ben Ellen. Ask for your aye vote.
Thank you very much. Madam Secretary, please call the roll.
Gatto?
Aye.
Gatto, aye. Patterson?
Not yet.
Patterson not voting. Ashajian? Ashajian, aye. Bonilla? Aye. Bonilla, aye. Burke? Aye. Burke, aye. Daly? Aye. Daly, aye. Eggman? Aye. Eggman, aye. Garcia? Garcia is absent. Hadley?
Aye.
Hadley, aye. Roger Hernandez?
Aye.
Hernandez, aye. Obernolte?
Aye.
Obernolte, aye. Quirk?
Aye.
Quirk, aye. Santiago? Aye. Santiago, aye. Ting?
Aye.
Ting, aye. Williams? Aye. Williams, aye.
That measure is passed. SB 380 is passed, and we will hold the roll open for a couple minutes if anyone else wants to add on. Thank you very much, everybody.
All right, that was an interesting thing. That was entertaining. You know,